So today's topic again, we're going to focus on the new mandatory dairy pricing cost and yield survey. Leonard, Andy, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it. And again, as soon as you complete that poll, I do encourage all of you to put a question into that Q&A section on Zoom here. From at least my experience, I'm sure Dr. Novakovic will appreciate it as well. We love to answer the questions that industry is asking, right? So we can kind of use that to gauge the areas that we will be talking on today. The main focus that we want to kind of dive into a little bit and add some information around is this portion of the One Big Beautiful Bill that came out. And it's in section 10314 for those of you that want to dive into the language specifically of Title I of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that talks about this new mandatory make and yield cost survey that's coming out from or facilitated by USDA from this new piece of legislation. So with that, I think there's an interplay with kind of some of how federal milk marketing orders operate and work, and there's kind of some greater discussion that can be had there as well. But for a bulk of at least where we're starting from in our conversation here today is on what this looks like. Kind of some of the history around this and where we go from here. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Novakovic, and we can kind of start down that course and see what questions come in and adjust from there.
All right. Thank you, Leonard. I am not going to speak for 50 minutes or 40. I'm really hoping that I can throw some things out there and we can see what sort of things those of you who are in the audience are really interested in. And for my part, you're welcome to pose questions, anything related to dairy markets and policy, not just this survey. And in point of fact, I don't think I could talk for 15 minutes about the survey, in as much as there's a lot left to be developed before we can really get very specific about that. So I thought what I would do is give a little bit of context for what's led up to that particular part of so-called federal order modernization. And I think I'm also going to make a few comments about other dairy policies outside of federal orders. To begin with, I guess I'd like to say what's probably obvious. The last half year or longer has been pretty unusual and fairly tumultuous for dairy. Things have changed rather dramatically in terms of market conditions over the course of the last year, 2 years, with a lot of variables moving into ranges that we frankly really haven't seen before. Butter prices were incredibly high, historically high, even adjusting for inflation. Beginning around late most of 2024, but in the last few months have kind of nosedived. Powder prices, in contrast, had some ups and downs. The last few weeks and month or so have been a little lower, but basically, if you look over the last couple of years, powder prices have been kind of a flat line trending around sort of a central value. So the relationship between fat and skim solids has really changed dramatically. And that's pretty recent and quite a bit different from what we had been talking about 6 months ago. Input costs, feed costs in particular, have been another pretty dramatic story for dairy. And contrary to our brethren who are crop farmers, the story for dairy has generally been pretty positive. We've seen pretty high margins over feed costs, and that continues to be the case, even though there's a bit of downward pressure on milk prices presently. Although those margins have come down, they're still at historically pretty favorable levels. Despite that obvious or apparent incentive to produce milk, we've struggled to have much of an increase because the beef market has been so astonishingly strong that it's encouraged sort of a doubling down on beef on dairy, a little bit heavier culling, less animals going into replacements. And again, that's another one that's just now really starting to change. We've seen quite a bit of, I would say, even a reversal of that. So we're at a moment where things are presently different than what we thought they were 6 months ago. And who knows how this unfolds. In saying all that, I think it's kind of useful to sort of put into context what of all that is the result of some policy choices and what of all that is really happening on its own merits, regardless of policy. And perhaps we can debate this, but I would offer the opinion that federal orders really don't cause these events. In fact, legislatively and from the standpoint of USDA operating ground rules, federal orders are trying to mimic or mirror or reflect market conditions, not drive market outcomes. And indeed, that is a part of the legislative mandate. So even if USDA somehow decided it wanted to be otherwise, it would be swimming upstream relative to the charge put forward to federal orders. So trying to reflect market conditions, not drive market outcomes. So when you see changes in federal order prices, this is really reflecting what's happening in the marketplace as we see through prices of butter and cheese and non-fat dry milk, what's happening to production, what's happening to exports, imports, and so on. For that matter, the other policies that we have, risk management and income supporting policies like dairy margin coverage, really aren't creating market outcomes, but sort of trying to help you deal with market outcomes. Risk management programs exist to help you do some forward planning. There's no guarantee that if you enter a futures contract, you're going to get the price you'd love to have, but at least you can establish what sort of a price area you're going to be in and make your plans accordingly. And of course, you can do that with feed and other products for which there is a futures market. With dairy margin coverage, again, that doesn't change market outcomes, doesn't cause market outcomes. But if there is a tightening, if there is a cost price squeeze, the dairy margin coverage program exists to provide some assistance to get through the rough spots. So I would say in the main, our policies, our economic policies aren't causing things to happen so much as trying to deal with things that happen on the fly. Bring this down now to more of a focus on what's been going on with federal orders. Although hopefully a lot of you didn't get too distracted by the hearing that occurred in Carmel, Indiana over the course of the better part of almost a year. And hopefully all the processes before and after that weren't too much of a distraction for you. But the fact is there was an awful lot going on under the banner of federal order modernization. There were a lot of industry conversations prior to USDA deciding to opening a hearing. Those conversations were trying to sort out changes that one or another parties thought would be either necessary or desirable to update federal orders relative to their most recent update, which frankly was the better part of 25 years ago when they were when we concluded the so-called federal order reform process in 2000. That industry process ultimately led to a request to have a hearing. And as is typically or always the case, anybody can request anything, but the Secretary of Agriculture looks for some sort of consensus as to the kind of changes that would be met. Just because somebody says something doesn't oblige USDA to open a hearing. But if there's clearly a broad level of support to talk about an issue or to do a particular thing relative to an issue, that's compelling. And also to consider how much is at stake. We generally don't open the door to just any old, whatever it is you want to talk about. We try to frame it to be a more manageable conversation. And In the hearing that was rulemaking that was recently completed, we decided to focus on questions entirely related to how milk is priced in terms of establishing those minimum prices. A huge piece of that was the discussion about so-called make allowances. Just as a reminder, in the late 1990s, we were still using prices that were reflecting market conditions for farm milk outside of the federal order. The so-called MW price on grade B milk had been a standard since the 1960s and into most of the 1990s. And we came to realize that although that was desirable in many ways as sort of a benchmark of market conditions, it had reached a point where it really wasn't a good indicator for the value of grade A milk everywhere else. It just wasn't that much grade B milk available anymore, and it didn't feel like that was a good way to take the temperature of dairy markets. A whole bunch of things were looked at as options. Each had their own virtues, each had their own flaws, and we ultimately decided to use the product formula approach that we're now using, wherein we look to the wholesale prices of 4 dairy commodities who we think are reflecting market conditions, that those prices are reflecting supply and demand in the normal way that one would hope, and then trying to figure out what the implication of those wholesale prices are for the value of milk at the farm level. We ended up with a system that has basically 3 simple factors. What are those wholesale prices, which we determine monthly as they exist? How much dairy product can I produce from 100 pounds of milk, or more specifically, the components of milk? And what does it cost to transform milk into those products? So that the basic idea is, if I make so much money selling cheese and whey, and it costs me a certain amount to make those, and if I, translate cheese pounds and whey pounds into milk pounds, how much can I afford to pay farmers if that is indeed the revenue I had from cheese and whey, or for, in the case of class 4, butter and powder? So those make allowances become a pretty critical piece of that overall calculation of a minimum price. Of course, minimum prices are not the end of the story. The end of the story is what you get paid when you sell milk, which can be greater than those minimum prices, and in some cases can be less if you're talking about milk that isn't pooled, or if you're talking about a cooperative that has the ability to reblend revenues and pay prices as they believe they can afford. But in any case, they are critical in establishing minimum prices. We had gone for almost 20 years without updating those prices. And I don't think it's particularly controversial to say, pretty unlikely that the cost of processing dairy products was unchanged between the mid 2000s and 2023, 2024, when we were talking about those. There was almost, I would say, pretty much universal agreement that we needed to update those make allowances, but there was anything but universal agreement on what that update should specifically be. And in the end, a lot of that conversation was driven by studies of manufacturing costs for producing those products. Now, we've got, a fair amount of information about what it costs to produce milk. We've got some simple, incredibly simple indicators like the formula that's used in dairy margin coverage. We've got a few states universities that have some farm cost accounting. Not many are left, but there's at least 3 that I can think of. USDA does some cost studies. There are some accounting firms that provide cost information. And whatever that landscape is for farm costs of production, it's considerably more than what we have for dairy processing costs. There is no USDA study. There really aren't any ongoing university studies There are some accounting firms that do cost accounting for clients, and in some cases share that. But it's not you don't just Google that up or go to some AI chat box and say, what's the cost of producing butter? So we had information that came importantly from Dr. Mark Stevenson, recently retired from UW. We had a little bit of information from folks in California. We had testimony from folks at the National Milk Producers Federation, which was largely based on information from their members. But that was about it. And throughout that conversation, there was a lot of belief statements saying, boy, this would be a lot better if we had a more formalized, structured way of collecting these costs that obliged relevant firms to participate and allowed for the verification of the information they submitted. And I can't think of any major organization or major voice that disagreed with the notion that it would be desirable for future work to have USDA be responsible for doing formal cost accounting studies that would require participation, and which would be subsequently audited or verified by USDA, much as they audit the records on pricing transactions under the weekly price survey, or how they audit federal order submissions under the federal order pricing program. Well, that's all well and good. However, USDA can't just say, oh, sure, yeah, let's go do that. They have to have formal authorization that only comes from Congress to give them the authority, the right to require a cheese company to submit cost accounting records or what have you. And they have to have a little money to do that. It doesn't require a lot of money, but there's obviously an expense. And, not an inconsequential expense to develop the surveys, administer them, run them, and so on, especially when you talk about the auditing component, which requires people to actually go to plants and look at records and so on. That process of getting approval for doing such a survey took a little while. And of course, no small part of that was all the other things that were going on at the congressional level that made something like a cost survey for dairy products feel like fairly small potatoes compared to other big issues that were occurring, even though there was broad industry support to do this. Well, ultimately, when we finally got that big piece of budget legislation passed in the middle of the year, somehow, kind of magically, there was a paragraph that was inserted that says, here's some money to go do a study, and we'd like it if you publish this study result every couple of years. And literally, that's about it. I don't know, I didn't count them up, but there's like 45 words in that authorization. And it really says only a few very broadly guiding things. One is, it says if you submit price information under the National Dairy Product Price Report, you will be required to submit cost information for those same products. So the target of plants is well defined, and they're related exactly to the same prices that are used in the federal order price calculations. It also says that we, USDA, will collect information on product yields, which are the third parameter in the product price formula. So we'll get refreshing up of what those yield relationships are. And it says you'll publish results every 2 years. It doesn't say the timing of the cost survey. If you, the way that thing reads, you could say, tell me what it cost to produce cheese last Tuesday. That would be pretty ridiculous, but it doesn't actually define that. It would be reasonable to imagine that it'll be a year, an annual review that is consistent with all the work that's ever been done previously. But it doesn't say what year. It doesn't say when the first report is due. It just says once you get into it, you got to do it every couple of years. At the moment, USDA is engaged in a process to think about how would they go about doing this. And it will continue to pursue that until a final rule is established that says, this is how we're going to do it, this is who's going to be required to report, and blah, blah, blah. That process of developing a rule is kind of the pieces of it are pretty well understood, but I can't put dates on when this, that, or the other will happen. What I can tell you is that the procedure that USDA will follow is not the super complicated procedure of formal rulemaking where you know, go to some hotel and sit in a big room and yak at each other for days on end, and then have all kinds of paperwork that becomes part of that, but rather what's called informal rulemaking, which is really the way almost every rule in U.S. government is created to begin with. Informal rulemaking is the one that's odd. Formal rulemaking is the one that's odd. Informal is what's normal. And under informal rulemaking, an agency, in this case USDA, has to think about, okay, what's this rule going to look like? Why am I doing this rule? What's my authorization? What's my authority? What are the parameters that I have to work with? And come up with a rule. They then propose this rule. They publish it publicly for people to review. And they said, here's what we're thinking about doing. And you have maybe 60 days to comment. Okay, you send in your comments, then USDA has to digest those comments, think about, oh yeah, it's a good idea, we should probably do that, or I don't know, that was not such a good idea, we won't do that. And ultimately publish a final rule. It's also true that this is not strictly only an internal USDA process. USDA has to kick the can outside of USDA for approval by higher levels of the executive branch. And, you know, those things take time. And ultimately, when all of that is sorted out, then a final rule will be published, and usually pretty quickly, then the rule will be implemented. If you're interested, the last time USDA engaged in this sort of process was when the so-called Dairy Product Mandatory Reporting Program was created. That's the overarching name for the program that gives us the weekly surveys of the 4 dairy commodity prices, which are averaged over a month and then become the monthly prices that drive the product formula. The legislation that established that program was signed on September 27th of 2010. So keep track of fall 2010. On the 10th of June in the following year, USDA published a proposed rule to create that sales report. Comments were due on the 9th of August relative to that 10th of June, so 2 months later. And on the 15th of February in 2012, the final rule was published. The first weekly report was for prices that occurred during the week of the 19th of March. So it was about a year and a half between when Congress actually wrote the authorization that said, go do this, to the point where we actually did it in terms of the price report. That gives you an idea of sort of the steps and the fact that it takes a little while. The only other thing I can add is that doing a cost accounting for cheese, butter, non-fat dry milk, and dry whey is a lot more complicated than asking people to say, what were the prices that you sold those products at? So I don't think it's unreasonable to imagine it's going to take a little bit longer to figure out how to do that with some integrity as compared to the price survey, which ultimately was quite a bit simpler. Beyond the make allowance thing, there were kind of a potpourri of other issues that were looked at the federal order hearing. A lot of them had to do with class one pricing and class one issues, the so-called higher of versus average plus calculation, the location differentials that affect not only class one prices, but also producer prices. There was also one that was related to the benchmark that we use to determine the value of skim milk. A couple things about that. This potpourri of additional items that were discussed generally had the effect of increasing minimum prices to farmers, whereas the make allowance increase generally had the effect of decreasing the minimum price to farmers. They tended to offset when you looked at a national level, but as you might imagine, in high class one markets, the uplift was greater than in the low class one markets, such as we have in the upper Midwest. So on net, not so much difference, but the story becomes different when you look at different parts of the United States. Another little caveat is the change in how we determine the skim milk value of class one milk didn't come into effect until this month, or perhaps I should say, it won't come into effect. It will first come into effect with the valuation of December milk. So we've got some of those prices, but we haven't gotten to the point of where we're actually looking at producer prices on December milk yet. So that's just coming into play now, which by itself is actually a little bit unusual. And we typically implement everything all at once, but it was decided to delay this one until December. So we're just beginning to see that. That will have an uplifting effect on all class one valuations everywhere in every order. It will also have an uplifting effect on valuations for class two, three, and four in the three southeastern orders and Arizona, which do not use multiple component pricing. So for those areas, it will have a little bit bigger effect than in others. Again, in the upper Midwest, the impact of that will be somewhat muted because the amount of class one milk is so small compared to the total market. So that's pretty much where we're at on the federal order side. I'll just quickly say on other programs, the so-called Farm Bill programs, we did have the good news of getting a long-term extension on the authorization of those programs. That authorization is now extended to 2031. The bad news, if you want to call it that, is what we've basically done is extended the programs that were written in the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018. That bill was supposed to be reviewed, reconsidered, updated, whatever Congress wanted to do in 2023, and we have been unable to follow the normal time schedule. So at least we've taken the uncertainty about those programs away by having them extended to 2031. But by the same token, I think there are a lot of folks who are eager to have a proper farm bill discussion and see whether or not there might be some other things that we should refresh, update, maybe add, maybe delete, and whether or not that conversation can occur in 2026. I guess we'll find out. The last thing, Leonard, that I'll just throw out there, which you may be seeing, is this thing called the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act. The Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act is an idea that has been floated around for a few years now, which is really reacting to the requirement that was created during the Obama administration, which says that school lunches must serve either skim or 1% white milk or only skim chocolate milk if they want to be eligible for school lunch reimbursements. And of course, those school lunch reimbursements are incredibly important to schools, so it essentially becomes a requirement. The dairy industry has pushed against that and argued that they didn't agree with it, they didn't think it makes sense, and believe that it's harmful to them. But USDA really had its hands tied by the dietary guidelines that said this is what we need to do for feeding young children. Those dietary guidelines are now under review. The timing for that was actually early this year, 2025. Um, Secretary Kennedy and Secretary Rollins decided they wanted to kind of review the review. It's been suggested by Secretary Kennedy that there will be a massive revision to those guidelines. He's talked about reducing the length of the guidelines substantially and probably changing the contents. But at this point in time, no such guideline has been introduced. And if it is, I'm not going to guess what it will contain. In the meantime, we have to go with the existing guidelines. And one of the things that the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act does is it says you can serve any kind of milk you want in a school district. If they want to serve skim milk, that's their choice. If they want to serve whole milk, they can do that. That's their choice. And to make it work within the broader guidelines that exist presently, whole milk and 2% milk are exempted from the caloric maximum caloric requirement, the maximum fat requirement, and the maximum saturated fat requirement. So it basically says the reason why they weren't put in there is because you couldn't really satisfy those other conditions unless you stuck to low-fat milk. And now they're saying, okay, we're not going to count those. Those are going to be free calories, free fat content from the standpoint of the other dietary guidelines. In a previous congressional session, the House had already approved that act, but that approval expired when that term of Congress ended. So now that the Senate has approved it, it's actually got to go back to the House to get approval by the second chamber. Everybody's expecting that they will. When that happens is, a different issue. I can't imagine they're going to have time to do that this month. But when they do, I think it's pretty much a given that President Trump would sign that legislation. And so perhaps next year we'll see some new rules for schools. That's it for me, Leonard. And I'm really hoping that you've got an audience that's got some other questions, maybe some comments, and I'm happy to be helpful in any way I can.
So I have a few, I guess, follow-up questions here. In the legislation for the survey, it states for all products processed in the same facility or facilities. So your estimation on this, is that going to encompass things outside of those, 4 benchmark products that are included in NDPSR? What does this look like?
Yeah, so I think that's in many ways a practical cost accounting question. So by tying it to the price survey, we're identifying a specific number of plants, very specific plants. By the way, the identity of those plants is confidential. There's no list of plants that are providing information. That's proprietary information that USDA would not share. We know at the back of every report, there is a tabulation that says there were 15 entities that gave us whey information. There were 23 entities that gave us cheese information. We also know that an entity might be an individual plant, or it might be a company or a cooperative that has multiple plants and kind of are grouping them all together to make one report out of 2, 3, 4, 5 plants. So we know that, but we don't necessarily know how many individual plants there are, and we definitely don't know how many companies there are. From a cost accounting standpoint, you really can't isolate the cost of one thing in a plant that produces many things. So in order for USDA, or for that matter, anybody else who's studied costs previously, you really have to collect information on the entire business operation of that plant. And honestly, if you're talking about a company that has many plants, there's going to be some sort of corporate level information that also is then going to end up being assigned to those plants. And that's also kind of part of the consideration. But the implication of that is we will collect data on every product produced at that plant. But I think the implication also is that the reporting will be confined to the products that are part of the survey. So if some plant that's reporting butter also produces anhydrous milk fat, we're not going to do some cost of anhydrous milk fat calculation, but we will collect that data so we can assign all the costs properly to each of the products that are made.
So we have class 3 components, class 4 components, class 3 to cheese, class 4 to butter, just in the easiest way of thinking about things, right? But when we have these end products, a lot of times, it's not just protein, it's not just fat that goes into the final product that's manufactured. So how granular do you think on a component basis, or the constituent components of that end product, do you think the reporting might be, or how, if when this comes out, if what sort of inferences, say for other, say lactose or things like this, will you be able to derive from any of this information?
So one thing I could say is USDA is going to come up with its own tool, but the work that Mark Stevenson has done is, I think, a good example of how one goes about doing cost accounting. I might also mention that the first cost analysis that Mark did was in 1989 at Cornell. So he's been doing this for 35 years, and as procedures have become pretty sophisticated, he's thought through a lot of questions about how to do this and so on. And if you have access to any of Mark's earlier reports, I think they provide a good insight into what a cost survey looks like. The California Department of Food and Agriculture also did cost surveys under its old state pricing program, which of course has not been replaced with the federal order program. But if you have access to those California studies, they also are indicative of what that all looks like. And I would say, as a general comment, from the standpoint of data input to the cost survey, it's got to be very granular. You're going to ask, what did you use to make these dairy products? Which, of course, will include milk, but it's also going to include all kinds of other dairy ingredients. It could be liquid skim milk, it could be dried milk powder, it could be evaporated skim milk, it could be cream, it could actually be butter itself. So a host of intermediate agreements, so ultra filtered milk, milk protein concentrates, you name it. All of that potentially could be an ingredient that's used by a plant to make whatever dairy product. Cheese in particular is an industry that tends to use a variety of ingredients. Butter maker quite likely will buy milk, but there are going to be times a year when they're actually getting cream from other plants. Fluid milk plant typically spins off a lot of cream and will sell that cream to a butter plant. So there's all kinds of ingredients coming in. We're going to need to know the quantities. We're going to need to know the composition, how much fat came in this way, how much skim solids came in this way, how much protein came in this way. We're going to trace all that way through to what products did you make, which isn't going to be, we don't care what label you put on it. We don't care if it was, chocolate or whatever, but we need to know how much fat was used in final products, how much skim solids, how much protein was used in final products, so we can match up what was coming in with what's going out. And of course, we're going to need to figure out what costs occur that bookend between what did I sell those products for, the wholesale price, and this farm value that I'm trying to infer. So what are all the costs that occur in between there? And, they're going to include heavily processing costs, but there's going to be a few other things that are involved in that. There might be some transportation, and in certain cases, there might be some storage. There's going to be corporate overhead costs, what's depreciation, what's interest, all kinds of stuff besides just turning a switch on a piece of equipment. That'll be pretty granular. What comes out in the published report is going to be some numbers that describe the range of costs of producing butter, dollars per pound of butter, dollars per pound of non-fat dry milk, dollars, etc. So the output will be much simpler looking than the input.
Can I interject here and just ask a question, Leonard? Is that okay? So Andy, maybe sort of a maybe 30,000 foot view of this survey. I can anticipate all of the use that economists like Leonard, you yourself and myself might gather from these reports, or that USDA might use to actually inform the federal order and so on. Are there any implications or signals that you anticipate to be included in these reports that might be useful for farmers? I'm asking this on sort of behalf of the farmers that might be on this call. Like if they should be systematically checking these reports, as they come out to better make decisions on farm. Is there anything in there that's going to be better signals for on-farm decision-making aspect?
Well, probably general awareness and also confidence in the numbers. But when we've talked to processors about these surveys, one of the things that they will bring up is both internal benchmarking and external benchmarking. So the internal benchmarking is you just told me that my cost of producing cheese is X. We already thought we knew what it cost us to produce X or to produce cheese. So let's see if your estimate matches my estimate or how different they might be. So that's kind of a cross check on my own internal number. Of course, that necessarily implies that USDA would give a report back to a company that would say, this is your number, and maybe contrast it with everybody else's number. Not that you would know each individual plant, but rather the average of everybody else. Confidentiality is huge in these reportings. Well, we can tell somebody their own number. The external benchmarking is to look at all those other numbers to say, what did other people achieve? In the California survey, for example, California would routinely publish results for what they called small plants and large plants. So if you felt yourself to be in one category or the other, you could say, how do I do compared to other small plants, or how do I do compared to other large plants? So from a farmer perspective, I can think of a couple things. One, if you're a member of a cooperative that's operating one of these plants and you listen to your cooperative managers talk about what they're experiencing, this would be an external benchmark that you could look at to say, how are we doing? And maybe you go, yay, yippee, we're doing great. Maybe you say, how come we're not doing better? But at least it's some kind of data. The other thing is, I think it in some ways, these things are a little bit unavoidably a bit of a black box, but it shines a light in that black box and gives at least everybody a sense that a third party who has no interest in skewing the data one way or the other has looked at this, has done a verification procedure to establish some integrity of those numbers, and that this is reliable. I think that's a positive. At the end of the day, I don't think that helps you run your farm any better, but it may help you understand the market environment better.
Could you touch on auditing mechanism, even if it's not the mechanism, but kind of what the uniqueness or difference between the survey and the auditing that comes with that versus, say, other reporting?
Yeah, so I imagine most of the people on the line, who certainly those who are running a business, have experience with their own accountant, and perhaps if an auditor, an external auditor, depends on obviously the nature of the company, whether or not you have to have your books audited. But if you have any familiarity with auditing, you understand that there are shades of gray in auditing that range from a deep dive that looks very, very closely at a whole lot of records to gain a high level of confidence that the reporting is accurate and can be established relative to the raw records that created the report. Then there's also a much lighter review process that really does not open up the checkbook and look at every check, but rather does maybe not a 30,000 foot scan, but maybe a 7,000 foot scan to see what procedures were followed, maybe check it at a much higher level. and there are shades of gray in between. In the price transaction report of the national survey that's done every week that gives us those monthly prices, those records are reviewed. They are not checked with an electron microscope, but they are checked to make sure that there's consistency and truthfulness in the reporting. Again, the final rule hasn't been published, but I think it would be reasonable to assume that USDA would definitely do some checking, but it would not be hands-on every piece of paper kind of checking. It would be more in the nature of a review. And if you found something in that review that seemed a little bit irregular, then that requires further review. And so I think it's fair to expect a review of that nature.
The other question is, not to put you on the spot, but if we think about make allowance, which again, as we discussed, is kind of that the step or progression of things that kind of brought us to this survey to get information to kind of guide that. There's if you want to maybe kind of frame some of the economic theory around make allowance. We have to account for, in the pricing system we have to account for that cost of transformation, which is that make allowance. But oftentimes we'll hear some contention around like, hey, where in this value system we're kind of moving those levers and their impact on pay price and kind of this greater discussion around make allowance and impacts and things like this. I know I've heard you kind of frame this in different contexts or in different light over time. And I was just curious if you had any great insights to share with folks today on kind of that lever, if you will.
Yeah, well, I don't know how great they are, but let me try this. As I said before, USDA does not want to drive market outcomes. It's not seeking to put somebody out of business and somebody else to become hugely profitable. It's trying to reflect supply and demand conditions as they exist. And that is historically true, and it's part of the mandate and the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act that is the basis for all of this, all of the federal orders. Okay, swell. All right, so that's my goal. How do I do that? And historically, it's important to keep in mind that federal orders didn't just kind of like spring up everywhere and start regulating milk prices everywhere. It was a very, very slow and organic process from the 1930s up until today, not quite, but getting close to 100 years later. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1960s that half of the US milk supply was priced under a federal milk marketing order. And even today, it's not 100% by a long shot, maybe 70%, maybe 65%, something like that. And so with that, several decades of lots of milk being bought and sold outside of federal order price regulation, it wasn't very hard to look at what was happening in those other markets and say, maybe this is telling us something about the value of milk from a purely supply and demand perspective. And maybe we can mirror that in our federal order pricing. It's also true that in those bygone days, the regions that were covered by federal marketing orders was much, much smaller, like city-sized regions, not even state, never mind multi-state. And so each of these areas would have their own thing that they thought made sense for them. And using prices for commodities as sort of the benchmark of market value was fairly commonplace. There were places that priced milk off of what was happening with evaporated and condensed milk, prices that were based on cheese, prices that were based on a host of things, including prices for farm milk in unregulated areas. USDA has always been comfortable, which is to say the industry has always been comfortable with looking at some kind of external unregulated benchmark. The CME does that in the cheese industry. The sales report does that with the four commodities. Um, the GDT, the New Zealand market price, is another way that we kind of look at what's the market signal telling us. And so what we have now is a reliance on these wholesale prices from which we can infer a market value. The idea is if you're making this much money on the output end, how much can you afford to pay on the input end? And the make allowance is simply the wedge in between what your gross revenue is and what we think you can afford to pay for those inputs. Needless to say, not every company sells their dairy products for the same price. And just the same way, not every company has the same cost of producing, but we try to get some sort of average of averages to be as consistent as we can, keeping in mind that we're establishing minimum prices. We're not establishing the price. And so we try to give the market room to maneuver around or above those minimums.
So I do want to leave it open for more questions yet, but I do want to make sure we ask this, is that from the producer side, processor side, I guess your dealer's choice on this one. But when we look to 2026 here, what do you think the biggest factors are going to be that are going to shape the year ahead?
Well, we always talk about price, and of course we do. I mean, that's sort of the bottom line. But there's a whole lot of stuff that shapes price outcomes. And when I think about sort of those underlying causal factors, the big stuff that I think about is the volatility and uncertainty in international markets, which can work to our advantage, but can also create challenges for us. But the point is, it's a little hard to predict which way it's going to be going. Labor ability, which means both, is there somebody to work, but also what do I have to pay for that person? And that's on the farm, but it's also downstream. If my processor is unable to get an adequate labor supply, that's going to impact me as a farmer in terms of my ability to sell that product. The robustness of domestic demand as well as international demand. I got to tell you, I'm even though I'm getting kind of old, I understand social media, blah blah blah. But when some 20-year-old influencer can persuade people that they ought to drink more milk because it's got fat in it, or they ought to have more protein in their coffee, for crying out loud, it really makes you wonder, what are the levers that are going to be pushing on demand? And I don't know that we can always guarantee that's going to be on the upside. That uncertainty around what factors will be shaping demand, I think, is a big part. Technological change, AI is a big thing. It's not quite there yet, but my goodness, it's pretty darn close. That has big implications on both farm and downstream levels. In some ways, maybe that creates opportunities at the farm level, but I also think it has structural implications, small farms versus large farms. I see that as a huge deal. And climate change and our ability to adapt to more extreme and volatile weather, I think, is big. It's obviously a big thing for crops, but it's also a pretty big thing for the welfare of animals and the welfare of workers. Those are all huge issues, and I think the survivors are going to be the people who can adapt and surmount those issues in the best way possible.
We have just a few minutes here, so we'll let those final questions come in. One question that was asked to me, not to be too far in left field here, but just for the last 2 minutes, high protein whey. It's really having a moment right now. Like you just said, we have high protein whey creamers, all of these things. But will high prices cure high prices in this case? And what's your quick 2-minute perspective on that space at the moment?
Well, you only get whey if you make cheese. And so you got to have a combination of things that create this price incentive moment. the whey story, and for that matter, milk proteins are a big deal, and certainly are going to have an uplifting effect. But you got to look at kind of the whole package. Again, I'd also say, I don't know if I were a processor. I mean, I think riding that pony for as long as you can is a great idea, but I don't know how many future plans you build around something that could be a fairly fragile demand effect.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. I know I always enjoy your insights and conversation. I think 1 hour to capture the depth and breadth of knowledge always seems a bit constrained, but really appreciate you sharing your time with us here today.
Sure, my pleasure.